Hello and welcome back to our webinar series on product management training with Ftrack. This is session number 3, where you'll learn how to set up user groups and permissions. In our previous sessions, we focused on setting up in Ftrack Studio, which you can get access to by speaking to your SDR or your CSM, your customer success manager. My name is Michael Sears. I'm the sales development rep for the Americas at Backlight, and I'll be one of your hosts for the webinar. Joining me again is Backlight's solution consultant, Kyla Laban. Kyla has over 7 years of experience in VFX and television and has worked for well-known studios such as MPC, Method, and as well as on projects like WandaVision, Ghost in the Shell, and a whole lot more. Today, we'll be running through 4 key areas. The first will be adding your team. The second will be understanding roles and permissions. The third is assigning roles. And the fourth is individual user settings and a little bit more that comes with all of that. Kyla will be running the webinar, which we expect to last about 45 to 50 minutes as usual. Please use the Q&A panel anytime throughout the presentation, and we'll try to respond at the end of the webinar or during. If we don't get to answer your questions during the webinar today, we also offer office hours to support any of your requests. There will be a link to register for those in the follow-up email. But feel free to ask questions in the chat in the meantime. Without further ado, let's get our third session started. Over to you, Kyla.
Great. Thanks, Michael. So welcome back, everyone. I hope that if you celebrated some holidays over the last month, that you enjoyed them or that you just had some time off to relax. But we're back in the swing of it now. So as Michael's already mentioned, in today's session, we're going to be going over users, groups, and permissions. So obviously, Ftrack is a collaboration tool. It's all well and good to create a bunch of tasks and schedule out your work. But if nobody is actually in your Ftrack workspace to be able to see that and know what they're meant to work on, it doesn't do a whole lot of good. So we're going to go over how to actually get your users all set up in Ftrack. We'll go over groups. That's essentially how to organize all of your users and some of the functionality that offers you as well. And of course, we will be going over permissions or roles, as we call them in Ftrack. And that's basically just controlling what your users are allowed to do and or see when they log in to make sure that they have the functionality that is required for whatever job function they are serving on your team and on your projects. And it is worth mentioning again for this particular session, if you are planning on following along with me today, that you are going to need to make sure that you have administrator privileges on your workspace. If you don't, however, don't worry, this is still a useful session to sit in and observe. There's a lot of good context and kind of understanding around how users operate within Ftrack that is useful for you to be aware of, can help you with troubleshooting. Let's say if you have somebody on your team who is saying, hey, I can't do this specific thing or see this specific thing when I log into Ftrack, it might help you be able to determine that it could be maybe a permissions issue. So what we'll be covering today is where in the system settings you are going to be able to find all of this user and groups information so that you can manage and moderate all of your users. We're going to go over what attributes, so what information you have visibility on for your users, what you can edit. And we are going to be covering everything and doing all of this manually in the UI for today's training, but just some additional options that are available depending on your Ftrack setup. So if you have an on-premise Ftrack deployment, you can also create all of your users with LDAP. And if you happen to be one of our enterprise clients, this also opens up single sign-on or SSO capabilities. So if you're interested in looking into those options to create your users in your workspace, we do have some documentation on our help center that can help you out with either of those if you want to go that route instead. All right, and so what we'll dive into next, of course, is how to invite or create a user within your workspace. We'll show you some of the information that you have access to view, where to view it, obviously, We will also be going into how to assign that permission role and how to set those up. And very, very briefly, we will touch on how this kind of relates and is connected to your billing and your licenses in your workspace. And then we'll dive into roles. So to start off, we are going to be again in the system settings. So a quick refresher of how you can find that is you're going to go to your user icon in the top right corner and click it and head over to system settings. If you don't see this option, that means that you don't have admin permissions in your workspace. And of course, we'll be talking about permissions later today. So you'll understand a little bit more on why. And the section we're going to be focusing on today is going to be just below this workflow section that we were working with in session 1 when we set up our workflow schemas. So that is resources just below here. And you can see that I've clicked on users and groups to bring me to this page here where I have visibility on all of the users that have been created and exist already in this particular workspace. You can see that I've got visibility on some of their information like their name, their username, their email. There are filters that you can use on this page. So if you do have a very large studio with a lot of users, that can help you filter down and find specific ones a little bit more quickly. I'm not opening this panel because I'm actually using this to filter out my own personal information since we're recording this in perpetuity. All right, so this is where you can access and manage all of your user information. If I need to add a new user to my workspace, I'm of course going to click Create User Account over here. And you can see that I have 2 different options that I can use now. So I can either send an invite. So down here below, you can see that I can also separate them with commas. I can just type in the email addresses of the specific individuals that I want to create a user account for in my workspace. So I could do something like artist1. And so on and so forth for however many people I need to add. And then I'll just click create account. What that's going to do is send an invite email to these individuals with a link that they will click that will redirect them to a page where they will actually put in their information, create a password, and then they'll be able to log into Ftrack for the first time. The other option that you can do, and this might actually be something that is useful if you are, say, setting up a user account for a new employee who maybe hasn't joined quite yet, is that you can also create an account manually. So you can see there's a little bit more information that might need to be put in here. You need to actually input their full name, their email, which will also be used as their username when they log in. And you can see that you've got the option, of course, to send that invitation email like the other option, but you can also uncheck that. And you can see that that will prompt you to set a password for them. So you can actually put that in there, not my one password, please disregard that. And you can also decide whether or not you want them to actually change that password the first time they log in. They'll be prompted to do so, or if you're okay with just letting them use that password you set as they continue. And finally, the last setting that is available on this particular page is enable account. So you can see that this is checked right now. When this is checked, what this means is this is an active user account. So that person that you have set this up for, as long as they have the password, can log into this account and access the entire Ftrack workspace. When this is not checked, it means that this is an account that has been deactivated. So it means even if that person still has the password, even if they go and try to log in, they're not going to be able to do so. And another place that you can view this particular information is in this column over here. So you can see for the users that exist in this workspace, everybody is an enabled user except for this particular one here who has been deactivated. So there's a couple different reasons why we have this feature. One, of course, is that oftentimes people may move on to other opportunities at other companies. If you happen to use freelancers frequently, where maybe you have people coming on for more short-term contracts, this allows you to basically deactivate that account very quickly once they are no longer working for you on your projects anymore, without losing any of that user information that may be tied to them. All right, so and another function that you could potentially use this for is if you wanted to set up some synthetic users, so people who are not real people, they could just have names like Animator1, Compositor1, FX Artist1. If you wanted to set up some deactivated accounts to represent that, so that you can maybe do a little bit of scenario planning, estimating how many artists you might need to complete a project, you can leverage deactivated users to do something like that. And the benefit of that is that those particular accounts will not be counting towards the licenses that you have available in your particular workspace. So your active users count towards the licenses that you are paying for in your workspace. You can see up here on this page, it will actually give you a little count of how many active licenses you're using. In my case here, I'm only using 10 out of an available 20. So you can always make sure that you're not exceeding the amount that you are paying for, first of all. So that will also allow you to be able to leverage that deactivated user functionality if that might be helpful. All right, so that is setting up your users where you can view all of the information. If you need to edit information after the fact, for any of your users, you can see as you hover over them, there's some little icons that appear. I can edit information right here. Maybe if I need to change a name, an email, reset a password for somebody, deactivate their account, I can do so there. You can see that you're actually able to delete a user account. However, we strongly recommend that you don't do this unless absolutely necessary for any particular reason. Deactivate their account instead. The reason for this being, let's say this particular user was working on a project, they had a lot of tasks assigned to them, they published a lot of versions, they had notes addressed to them where they responded to notes. If you go ahead now and delete this user account, you are going to lose record of that person everywhere in your workspace. So instead of seeing their username attached to those tasks, those publishes, those notes, you're just going to see unknown user. So if it's really important at your studio to be able to maintain that historical data connected to your users, even after they happen to maybe not be working for you anymore, we highly, highly recommend that you do not delete user accounts after the fact, simply deactivate them instead. And then finally, which is going to bring us into the next topic that we're going to be covering, is you can see that there is this little person icon, and that is for user roles. So as already mentioned, roles drives what permissions your users have when they log in. So we're going to go over how you can set these up to make sure that they're working for your studio, as well as how you can apply these to your users. So let me actually just close this down. All right, so of course, as you mentioned, permissions control what your users can see. There's a dedicated area in the system settings where you can create your own roles. You can duplicate or clone them in order to make sure that you're not starting from scratch every single time, if that makes it a little bit easier for you to set them up. And so once we've gone over that and we know how to create a new permission role, depending on what you need for your studio, we'll then hop back into how you can configure these for each of your users. All right, so we'll be moving on from this area just below where it says security. We're going to click on roles. There we are. And what I'm showing here are the 5 roles that come out of the box with Ftrack. And it's very important to note this one down at the bottom that says API. This does not relate to human users at all. This is only used to generate global API keys. So while we're talking about users, your team members, the people that you're actually working with, ignore this one completely. We're only going to be focusing on these top 4 up here. So these are roles that you will be assigning to users. And you can see that they are designated into 2 different types. So there are assigned roles and there are project-based roles. What this means for project-based roles is that when you give a user a role that is project-based, the permissions that that role gives them are going to be available to that user on every single project that they are working on. By contrast, an assigned type of user role means that this particular user is going to have a task assigned to them first before they'll be able to access those specific permissions. So that might be more the type of user role that you might use for someone like a freelancer, let's say, who maybe you don't want them to have as wide-ranging permissions. You very much want them to just be locked down to specific tasks that you are giving them to work on. So let's open up some of these user roles and take a look at what permissions are actually available. So I'm going to start going into this administrator one. You can see that I can edit it by clicking on the pencil icon over here, and that opens up our role editor. And you can see here that we've got a pretty wide range of permissions that are available, and they're broken down in global permissions and project permissions. And I will also mention, we are not going to be touching on custom attributes until our very last session, which is session 6, but you can set permissions on custom attributes. Just if you happen to see those pop up in the UI for today, just ignore them. We'll cover that later. We're just going to be covering these particular ones. But the difference between global permissions and project permissions are global permissions has more to do with, can users see certain pages in the UI? Can they do more overarching actions? Versus project permissions, which are very much more project-based, like, can I create a task? Can I update a status? Can I read the bid column, as an example? So that's how we've kind of broken down and determined the different permissions. And you can see, for instance, in this administrator user role, that they can pretty much do anything. They've got all the power. But if we're going to compare this to, let's say, the user permission, and this would most likely be the user role that you assign to perhaps an artist. If I open up the editor to look at this one, you can see that they have a lot less permissions that have been checked. So they're able to do a lot less than the administrator when they log in. And then if we compare that even further to the restricted user, that is the assigned user role type. And again, we're just focusing on these two areas up top here, but you can see that even the amount of options that are available to determine what permissions they have been restricted considerably. So this gives you a lot of flexibility when you're thinking about the different functions that your team members are going to have on your projects and what they actually need to have access to when they log in. So we do have these roles that are available out of the box. However, it's more than likely that you're probably going to need to tweak these slightly, that you may need to expand and add a few additional roles, depending on your studio, the types of projects that you're working on, the types of roles that people just have in your studio, not in Ftrack. So if you need to create any additional roles, of course, there is the create button up here. It's pretty straightforward. Just click that and select the different permissions you would like to set up. And of course, you have up here the ability to select the different role types. Again, API is not used for any users, so it'll be between assigned and project that you'll be selecting. And you just need to give your role a name, select the permissions you want, and hit save. However, to save you a little bit of time, the other option that you have is that you can actually clone a user role instead of building it up from scratch. So this is very similar to when we were setting up our workflow schemas in session 1, how we had the option to be able to clone a workflow schema and use that as a base to start creating a new one instead of having to do everything from scratch. So here we can see that I have this clone drop down, and because I have the project role type selected, you can see it's only showing me the user roles that are project based. So let's say that for the new role that I need to create right now, I want to set up a user role for any coordinators in my studio. I could assume that they would probably need very similar roles to a manager, but maybe just be able to do a few less things. So what I can do here is I can grab the project manager user role. There we are. You can see that it's populated the role editor with all of the permissions that a project manager has. And I can just go ahead from here and uncheck the specific things that I don't think I would want my coordinator to have access to. So I maybe don't want a coordinator to be able to create a project, let's say. Maybe I don't want them to be able to delete it just in case there are any accidents or user error that happens. Maybe I also wouldn't like them to delete objects either. I'll just keep it that way for now, just so I'm not sitting here putting too much thought into it. But let's say those are the only edits I wanted to make. I'm happy with this role now. I'm just going to give it a name. And I'll hit save. And you can see I now have a new role that's been added to my list. So you can go into your workspace, take a look at the way that those permissions have been set up for the out-of-the-box roles, and do a little audit and make sure that you've got everything you need and start adding in whatever additional roles might be necessary for the types of work that you're doing. Once you've done all that, that's when you can then go back into your users and groups area. So that's, again, back up here. And start assigning your roles to your team members. And you can see here, now that we've talked about roles, that there is actually an attribute column where you can see what roles your users have assigned to them. And you may notice that I do have a couple where they don't have a user role that has been assigned. If you want to avoid this happening, this being that if there is no user role assigned, when the user logs in, they won't be able to see or do anything in Ftrack. In the security area here under settings, you can see that you can actually set a default role. So as of right now, anytime a new user is created and logs in for the first time, if I haven't already selected a different role to give them on their user account, they will automatically be assigned that basic user role. That was an odd sentence, but you get what I mean. So that they will actually be able to have some basic functionality when they log in, as opposed to kind of being locked down and not being able to see anything. So you can check this particular area. Of course, if you want to select a different role to be the default one, you can also change that from here as well, but that's one option you have. So going back to our users and groups, I am going to use one of my users who doesn't have a role selected yet for this. So I'm going to go back to the roles button here, click on that. And then from this area here where I can select the different user role, I can grab the particular role that I want to give this user. I know it says their name is manager, but they're going to be a coordinator. So sorry. So I'm going to select that role and I'm going to hit add. So you can see it's now applied that coordinator user role to them. And now on the right-hand side of this dialog window, it's giving me two options. Either I can give them access to all open projects by toggling that on, or I can select individual projects from this list, and that will give them those permissions on only those projects. So you might be looking at this and say, but what does all open projects mean? So I know previously we have been, when we're making projects, I've been telling you to ignore this little toggle. We're finally going to talk about it. So we have our private access toggle when we're creating a new project. I'm going to, on Napo over here, go into the team tab. You can see that it appears here as well. What private access means is that when you turn this on, it's going to firewall your project and nobody will be able to see it in the Ftrack UI unless they have been given explicit permissions to access that project. So you can see right now that for project access, I've got a list of these particular users who can technically see this particular project. If I toggle on private access and hit save, you can see that all of those users have disappeared except for myself. And that is because none of them were explicitly added to the project. If I want any of them to now be able to see Napo, even though it is private, I have to go into user access and grant them explicit access to the project from here. This is essentially the software equivalent of when you have those very top secret, high security projects that you're working on where you have to take all the artists to a very specific place in the studio and kind of hide them behind a curtain so nobody knows what they're working on. This is basically what that is kind of replicating in software form. It's much easier to manage your workspace when you're not using this feature because this will also hide this particular project from your workspace administrator unless they are explicitly added into it. So Use caution when using it. Use it only when it's absolutely necessary. Otherwise, it might make it more difficult if you need any kind of troubleshooting help from your administrator for them to actually dive in and assist with anything that's going on. However, it does exist if you need it. If you have any very specific high security requirements with any particular clients that you might be working with, it is there. But essentially what this all open projects functionality does is that it will automatically grant these permissions to every project that has not been set as private. I am going to make this public again, however, before I go back in here. There we go. All right, so let's say, for instance, though, I don't want to give them access to all open projects. I'll toggle that off. I'll just give them back access to NAPO. So now they're a coordinator on NAPO. But let's say that the next project they're going to be working on, congratulations, they've got a promotion, they are going to be a manager. What I can do now is I can actually add multiple user roles to the same user and have it be different depending on what project they're working on. So I can go and grab my project manager user role now and add that to this user. So you can see now that they have 2 user roles. And for project manager, I can now select the specific project I want them to have those roles on. So now for this particular user, when they're working on NAPO, they're going to have the permissions that are set up through their coordinator user role. But then when they jump into Best Movie Ever, they are going to have the permissions that are set up through the project manager user role. So you can use this as well to kind of control in a lot more granularity what kind of permissions people might need per project. Another really good use case of this would be, let's say you've got an artist who is acting as a lead on a specific project. This will allow you to set up those very specific permissions in cases like that as well. All right, so that is user roles in a nutshell. So let's go over some best practices. First of all, don't make too many roles. So we do understand, obviously, that you are probably going to need to customize this a little bit more to your specific needs, but don't go too crazy. So very similar to what we were talking about when we were talking about creating your first custom workflow schema. Try to keep it as simple as possible. Try to think more about your team members' job functions and try to keep it as broad as you possibly can instead of trying to think of every specific kind of edge use case that may come up. Keep things open by default whenever you can. Obviously, we're talking about that private access functionality. So again, unless that's absolutely necessary for a specific project, try not to use it and just give people permissions per project as required. It just makes it a little bit easier overall to manage the workspace in its entirety that way. Make a copy of a role before editing. So this is just, of course, if you make some changes and it's not operating in the way that you're expecting it to, you're not having to remember what you added or removed and try to reverse engineer things to get back to that original role. Always make sure to copy and then save it. It'll make things a little bit easier. Test permission updates before assigning. So one thing that you could potentially use that deactivated user for is you could create yourself a synthetic user who is deactivated majority of the time, but maybe you just log in as them when you're testing out brand new permissions, just so that you can make sure that they're working correctly before you go ahead and start assigning them on your actual users. So that's really useful so that people are certain that they have the permissions they need once they start diving into Ftrack and the work that they need to do. Limit who can manage permissions. So initially this said have one person to manage permissions. However, we're human. Sometimes we get sick. Sometimes we go on vacation. So I think that that might be a bottleneck to only have one person controlling this for an entire studio, but limit it down to the absolute bare minimum people as you can, maybe 2 or 3 tops. This is something that you very much want to be very standardized and controlled and not have everyone in there making permission updates and edits wherever they can. Because obviously this drives access to projects, access to functionality, and you want to make sure that you don't have any surprises with people doing things that maybe they don't need to have access to. And finally, Audit your roles periodically, maybe once or twice a year, just to make sure that they are still meeting your requirements. So make sure that, if people's roles are evolving within your studio, the responsibilities that they have on your projects are changing or shifting slightly, that you're always going back and double checking that the way that you have your permission roles set up in Ftrack is accurately reflecting that, so everybody can do their job efficiently and properly. And that is everything for user roles. So let's move on, and we're going to talk, very briefly about groups. So groups are pretty self-explanatory. This is a way that you can group all of your users together in different configurations. If you want to group people together by department that they're working on, or project that they're working on, this allows you to control that. So we'll go over how to make groups and how to add users to them. And then we'll go over some of the functionality that this actually opens up within the UI. So you can address notes to entire groups instead of just individual users. And you can also leverage groups to help you assign users to calendar events, which I'm only going to show at a very high level and explain what they represent. Some of the additional functionality that you have through calendar events, we're actually going to go over in a bit more detail next week when we talk about views and dashboards. And the third thing that I will mention, which unfortunately I'm not able to demo yet because it's not released, but we do have some new functionality that is going to be released in the next couple of months. And user groups are going to be one of the options to leverage in order to open up that functionality. So keep an eye on our socials for when we start announcing the early release for that new feature. If that's something that's interesting to you, you can definitely go ahead and start trying that out at that point. So let's go back over to our workspace here. And this whole section that I have been ignoring on the side, this is our user groups. So you can see as I click through these that it's filtering down my list of users based on which group they have been assigned to. If I need to create a new group, of course, I'm going to click Create Group. That's added a new group to my list, and I can rename it up at the top here. So I don't have an effects group. Let's say this is effects. There we are. And of course, to add members, I will click Add Members. There we are. There's my group. If I need to remove someone, I will highlight them. You can see I've got the little purple highlight, very similar to our task spreadsheet, to let me know that that's the row that I've selected. And I'm just going to say remove members. And again, that is not deleting the user, that is simply removing them from the group. And you can also create subgroups. So you can see an example of that down here with my production user group. You can see that I've got a subgroup for just my producers. So if I want to create another subgroup for another specific production role, I can just click Create Subgroup, and it's added a new one here. And maybe this will be my managers group. And then I can go and add specific members to that one there. There you are. So setting up groups is pretty straightforward. That's everything you need to know. And now let's talk a little bit about what kind of functionality that has in the UI. So first off, assigning notes to entire groups. Let's hop back over to Napo and go back to our project page. So as an example, let's look at this particular shot. You can see that on this rendering task, I don't have an artist that's assigned. And maybe I have a new animation that I want to put on the farm. I can open up this task and go to my notes tab here and create a new note. Go over to my recipients editing here. And if I click here below my list of users, you can see that I have all of those groups that exist in my system settings appearing here. So I can grab my lighting group. And I can say, hey, team, can someone render this tonight? And what happens when I add this note is that everyone who is a member of this particular lighting group will receive a notification in their inbox right here for that particular note They can read it, they can reply to it if they want, if they have capacity to pick up and render whatever that thing is. So that just gives you another way to share information with your team. So there's my note. And I just remembered I skipped over something in terms of creating groups. Another place where you can actually create groups, and I'll come back to the calendar event functionality in a second. If I go back to this team tab for the project itself, and I go over to organize team, you can actually add an existing group from your system settings to the project itself. Or you can also create a project-specific group if you want to then take any team members and create groups like that for the specific projects you're working on, so that, you know, the example that I just used, that would have sent that particular note to every single lighting artist in my studio. If I wanted to narrow that down further and maybe create a lighting group for just the lighters that are allocated to this particular project, I can do that from this particular page in the project as well. So just something else to be aware of. All right, so on to calendar events. So to talk about these, we're going to be going over to the overview page, which is a new area we haven't really been looking at yet in these training sessions. So that's the section over here. And what the overview page allows you to do is see information across multiple projects all in the same place. So unlike the projects tab, where we're looking at the granular details of just one individual project, this will allow us to have cross-project visibility. I'm right now looking at the projects dashboard. There's a few different ways that I can display this information. I'm on this third option over here, which is our timeline view. So you can see that I've got a list of all of the projects that exist in my workspace here. And I've got a little timeline view very similar to our Gantt scheduler on the project. So what a calendar event is it's a very high level schedule, more like a phase, as opposed to a granular task that needs to be assigned to an individual person. So you could use calendar events to maybe represent how long you're anticipating to be in a specific department during a project. So as an example, I know that I have X amount of bid days allocated for layout. And so I know that I'm going to schedule it out from this date to this date, as a very high level example. That is what calendar events allow you to do from this area of the Ftrack workspace. So if I want to create a calendar event now, what I'm going to do is very similar to the scheduling we were doing on our task spreadsheet when we have the Gantt view, is I'm just going to click and drag my mouse on the timeline for a project. So there we go. And you can see that that has opened up this dialog window where I can now create my event. So I'll give my event a name. Let's call this animation. I'm going to assign a type to it. So these are the exact same types that you use for your tasks and that you created and customized in the system settings when we were talking about our workflow schemas. So I'm going to go grab animation. And you can see here that you can also allocate users to an event. So this is purely visual. It just allows you to know what projects your users are assigned to. There are a couple places you can see this information in the UI that I'll show you in a moment. But of course, if I just click on this dropdown, you can see that I'm getting every single user that exists within my workspace. If you're at a very large studio, that will be a very long list for you to scroll through to try and find the specific individuals you're looking for. So you can use the names of your groups to actually filter down this list. So if I type in animation, you can see that it's filtered down to only the users who are a part of my animation group. So I can now select these to be allocated to this particular calendar event. So there we are. I'll put in my bid days, say 20, and I'm going to hit save. And you can see that I now have a calendar event that's been created against this specific project. I can hover over it and you can see I've got my artists appearing there. I've got that bid information appearing, and I can also see the user icons for those particular users there as well. And you can keep continuing to make as many calendar events as you need as you're kind of blocking out your project there. All right, and then, so that is events and how you can leverage groups for that. Finally, let's go over some other areas in the UI where you can see user information. And this will be really, really helpful, especially for those users who can't access the system settings and see that information there. So don't worry, you can still have visibility on information tied to your user other places in the UI. So you can see here we do have the task spreadsheet listed. I'm obviously not going to go over that again. We did cover that in session 2 when we were talking about the task spreadsheet. So we know that you can assign users to tasks. You can group the entire task spreadsheet with your users. You can filter on users. If you missed our previous session, as Michael already mentioned, reach out to a sales rep or your CSM to get access to that recording. And we'll cover the ways that you can view this information from the overview page. So similar to this projects view here, there is also a user's dashboard. So I can click on this and let me go over this way. So you can see that I'm able to see my user information, either by cards or by lists. And there's also this timeline view. I don't have a whole lot of information there, so I am going to hop back into my personal workspace over here. So again, we're still on the user's dashboard, and this is the timeline view. And you can see here that I now am able to view all of my users' assignments and which calendar events they have been allocated to from here. So let's take a look at John here as an example. So in the same row next to his username, you can see the calendar event that he has been allocated to. And you can tell that this is an event and not a task because this has been cross-shaded here. So hovering over, there's his name. He's got his little icon appearing here. And then down below in this assignment section, these are all the tasks that he has assigned across whatever projects he is working on. And for some added functionality from here, you're actually also able to click and drag to reschedule these if you need to. So eliminating that need to hop back into that project page. And then finally, let's say that you need to drill into a bit more specific or deeper information for any of your users. You can also pull up that information in the sidebar. So if I want to take a look at Carmela, for example, I can click on her username to open up the sidebar here. And I've got a few different tabs that I can view. So if I want to just see some high-level profile information, I can see, for instance, her email address and the last time she logged in. Again, we'll be talking about custom attributes in session 6, but you can also create custom attributes to hold other more specific information for your users that you may want to track. I can see some recent activity that she's undertaken. I can see versions that she's published. And I can also have visibility on whatever tasks she has assigned to her here. So those are some different areas where you have access to different user information, even if you can't see it in the system settings due to whatever permissions you have set up in your Ftrack workspace. All right, so that is everything for users and groups and permissions that you need to know to set up your Ftrack workspace. Before we hop into questions, of course, we do have some homework again. So go ahead and invite a user to your workspace, or if you don't have someone that you can invite, practice this by creating a synthetic user that maybe you can use to test out your different roles. Create a group, add some users to a group, take some time to audit the existing user roles that we have available out of the box in Ftrack, have some time to think about what other user roles you might need in your studio and for the productions that you're working on. Duplicate or clone one of those roles and start making one of your custom ones for yourself as well. And then finally, if you go the route of creating that synthetic user, log in as them in a different browser, apply that user role to them, and see how that works. See if it's behaving in the way that you're expecting it to, and test that out.
From the whole team, thanks a lot. We appreciate you spending your time with us and hope you took something away during the session today. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.